The Fourth Way by Ouspensky. And before I start reading this will be chapter 1 that I'm going to start with. Before I start reading it, though, I've got to say a few things. One of them is that many years ago, I read some of his other books, Ouspensky's books. They were all based on Gurdjieff's teachings. The first one was Tertium Organum. Then there was The New Model of the Universe. And then there was The Search for the Miraculous. Now this one, I don't think I've read this one before, but it seems to me to be an important book. And because it is, I'm going to tackle it. Now, I'm thinking as I go along, I'm not going to be reading this like a computer. This isn't going to be an AI version. When I find it funny, I'm sorry, I laugh. When I find it sad, I kind of slow down and think about it. If you're okay with that, stick with me. There are probably other readings that you could go with. But this is my way of reading it. Okay, so let's start with chapter 1. Before I begin to explain to you in a general way what the system is about, and to talk to you about our methods, I want particularly to impress on your minds that the most important ideas and principles of the system do not belong to me. This is chiefly what makes them valuable, because if they belonged to me, they would be like all other theories invented by ordinary minds. They would give only a subjective view of things. When I began to write A New Model of the Universe in 1907, I formulated to myself, as many people have done before and since, that behind the surface of the life which we know lies something much bigger and more important. And I said to myself then that until we know more about what lies behind, all our knowledge of life and ourselves is really negligible. I remember one conversation at that time when I said, if it were possible to accept as proven that consciousness, or as I would call it now, intelligence, can manifest itself apart from the physical body, many other things could be proved. Only it cannot be taken as proved. I realized that manifestations of supernormal psychology, such as thought transference, clairvoyance, the possibility of knowing the future, of looking back into the past, and so on, have not been proved. So I tried to find a method of studying these things, and worked on that line for several years. I found some interesting things in that way, but the results were very elusive, and though several experiments were successful, it was almost impossible to repeat them. I came to two conclusions in the course of these experiments. First, that we do not know enough about ordinary psychology. We cannot study supernormal psychology because we do not know normal psychology. Secondly, I came to the conclusion that certain real knowledge exists, and that there may be schools which know exactly what we want to know, but that for some reason they are hidden, and this knowledge is hidden. So I began to look for these schools. I traveled in Europe, Egypt, India, Ceylon, Turkey, and the Near East. But it was really later, when I had already finished these travels, that I met in Russia during the war a group of people who were studying a certain system, which came originally from Eastern schools. This system began with the study of psychology, exactly as I had realized it must begin. The chief idea of this system was that we do not use even a small part of our powers and our forces. We have in us, so to speak, a very big and very fine organization, only we do not know how to use it. In this group, they employed certain Oriental metaphors, and they told me that we have in us a large house full of beautiful furniture, with a library and many other rooms, but we live in the basement and the kitchen and cannot get out of them. If people tell us about what this house has upstairs, we do not believe them, or we laugh at them, or we call it superstition, or fairy tales, or fables. This system can be divided into study of the world on certain new principles and study of man. The study of the world and study of man include in themselves a kind of special language. We try to use ordinary words, the same words as we use in ordinary conversation, but we attach a slightly different and more precise meaning to them. Study of the world, study of the universe, is based on the study of some fundamental laws which are not generally known or recognized in science. The two chief laws are the law of 3 and the law of 7, which will be explained later. Included in this and necessary from this point of view is the principle of scale, a principle which does not enter into ordinary scientific study, or enters very little. The study of man is closely connected with the idea of the evolution of man. But the evolution of man must be understood in a slightly different way from the ordinary. Ordinarily, the word evolution applies either to man or to anything else. No, let me read the sentence again. Ordinarily, the word evolution applied either to man or to anything else presupposes a kind of mechanical evolution. I mean that certain things, by certain known or unknown laws, transform into other things, and these other things transform into still others, and so on. But from the point of view of this system, there is no such evolution at all. I do not speak in general, but specifically of man. The evolution of man, if it occurs, can only be the result of knowledge and effort, as long as man knows only what he can know. In the ordinary way, there is no evolution for him, and there never was any evolution for him. Serious study begins in this system with the study of psychology, that is to say, with the study of oneself, because psychology cannot be studied, as astronomy can, outside oneself. One has to study himself. When I was told that, I saw at once that we do not have any methods of studying ourselves, and already have many wrong ideas about ourselves. So I realized that we must get rid of wrong ideas about ourselves and at the same time find methods for studying ourselves. Perhaps you realize how difficult it is to define what is meant by psychology. There are so many meanings attached to the same word in different systems that it is difficult to have a general definition. So we begin by defining psychology as study of oneself. You have to learn certain methods and principles, and according to these principles and using these methods, you will try to see yourselves from a new point of view. If we begin to study ourselves, we first of all come up against one word, which we use more than any other, and this is the word I. We say, I am doing, I am sitting, I feel, I like, I dislike, and so on. This is our chief illusion, for the principal mistake we make about ourselves is that we consider ourselves one. We always speak about ourselves as I, and we suppose that we refer to the same thing all the time, when in reality we are divided into hundreds and hundreds of different I's. At one moment when I say I, one part of me is speaking, and in another moment when I say I, it is quite another I speaking. We do not know that we have not one I, but many different I's connected with our feelings and desires, and have no controlling I. These I's change all the time. One suppresses another, one replaces another, and all the struggle makes up our inner life. I's, which we see in ourselves, are divided into several groups. Some of these groups are legitimate. They belong to right divisions of man, and some of them are quite artificial and are created by insufficient knowledge and by certain imaginary ideas that man has about himself. To begin self-study, it is necessary to study methods of self-observation, but that again must be based on a certain understanding of the divisions of our functions. Our ordinary idea of these divisions is quite wrong. We know the difference between intellectual and emotional functions. For instance, when we discuss things, think about them, compare them, invent explanations, or find real explanations, this is all intellectual work. Whereas love, hate, fear, suspicion, and so on are emotional. But very often, when trying to observe ourselves, we mix even intellectual and emotional functions. When we really feel, we call it thinking. And when we think, we call it feeling. But in the course of study, we shall learn in what way they differ. For instance, there is an enormous difference in speed, but we shall speak more about that later. Then there are two other functions which no system of ordinary psychology divides and understands in the right way: instinctive function and moving function. Instinctive function refers to the inner work of the organism: digestion of food, beating of the heart, breathing. These are instinctive functions. To instinctive function belong also ordinary senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, the feeling of cold and warmth, things like that. And this is all really, of outer movements. Only simple reflexes belong to instinctive function, because more complicated reflexes belong to moving function. It's very easy to distinguish between instinctive and moving functions. We do not have to learn anything that belongs to instinctive functions. We are born with the capacity to use all the instinctive functions. Moving functions, on the other hand, have to be learned. A child learns to walk, to write, and so on. There is a very great difference between the two functions, since there is nothing inherent in moving functions, and instinctive functions are all inherent. So, in self-observation, it's necessary, first of all, to divide these four functions to classify at once everything that you observe, saying, this is intellectual function, this is emotional function, and so on. If you practice this observation for some time, you may notice some strange things. For instance, you will find that it's really very difficult. You will find that what is really difficult in observing is that you forget about it. You start to observe, and your emotions connect with some kind of thought, and you forget about self-observation. Again and again, after some time, if you continue this effort to observe, which is a new function, not used in the same way in ordinary life, you will notice another interesting thing, that generally you do not remember yourself. If you could be aware of yourself all the time, then you would be able to observe all the time, or in any case, as long as you liked. But because you cannot remember yourself, you cannot concentrate, and this is why you will have to admit that you have no will. If you could remember yourself, you would have will, and you could do what you liked. But you cannot remember yourself. You cannot be aware of yourself. And so, you have no will. You may sometimes have will for a short time, but it turns to something else and then you forget about it. This is the situation, the state of being, the state from which we have to start self-study. But very soon, if you continue, you will come to the conclusion that almost from the beginning of self-study, you have to correct certain things in yourself which are not right, to arrange certain things which are not in their right places. The system has an explanation for this. We are made in such a way that we can live in 4 states of consciousness, but such as we are, we only use 2. One when we are asleep, and the other when we are what we call awake. That is to say, in the present state, when we can talk, listen, read, write, and so on. But these are only 2 out of 4 possible states. The third state of consciousness is very strange. If people explain to us what the third state of consciousness is, we begin to think that we already have it. The third state can be called self-consciousness. And most people have asked, say, certainly we are conscious. A sufficient time or repeated and frequent efforts of self-observations is necessary before we really recognize the fact that we are not conscious, that we are conscious only potentially. If we are asked, we say, yes, I am. And for that moment we are, but the next moment we cease to remember and are not conscious. So in the process of self-observation, we realize that we are not in the third state of consciousness and that we only live in 2. We either sleep or are in a waking state, which in this system is called relative consciousness. The fourth state, which is called objective consciousness, is inaccessible to us because it can only be reached through self-consciousness. That is, by becoming aware of oneself first, so that much later we may manage to reach the objective state of consciousness. So, at the same time as self-observing, we try to be aware of ourselves by holding the sensation of I am here, nothing more. And this is the fact that all Western psychology, without the smallest exception, has missed. Although many people came very near it, they did not recognize the importance of this fact and did not realize that the state of man, as he is, can be changed, that man can remember himself if he tries for a long time. It is not a question of a day or a month. It is a very long study, and a study of how to remove obstacles, because we do not remember ourselves, we're not conscious of ourselves, owing to the many wrong functions of our machine. And all these functions have to be corrected and put right. When most of these functions are put right, these periods of self-remembering will become longer and longer. If they become sufficiently long, we shall acquire 2 new functions. With self-consciousness, which is the third state of consciousness, we acquire a function which is called higher emotional, although it is equally intellectual, because on this level there is no difference between intellectual and emotional, such as there is on the ordinary level. And when we come to a state of objective consciousness, we acquire another function which is called higher mental. Phenomena of what I call supernormal psychology belong in these 2 functions, and this is why I made those experiments 25 years ago. I came to the conclusion that experimental work is impossible because it is not a question of experiment, but of changing one's state of consciousness. And I'm going to pause here and explain to you that I'm going to break up these long chapters into shorter, digestible parts. And I find this really fascinating. I don't know if you like it, but he really, like I say, I've read a lot by him in years gone by, but his philosophy, this is actually Gurdjieff's philosophy, is quite elusive. So even when you think you understand it and you maybe even work with it, it fades, and then you have to remind yourself or have someone remind you or read another book by him. Well, anyhow, here he goes. I hope you enjoy this, and till soon.